think we're almost ready, Dewi. I'll just
yeah, fine.
do a few. So, well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the 9th in our series of talks on contemporary photography. It's wonderful to have Dewi Lewis with us tonight, and he's going to do a talk about publishing photography, which of course is what he's best known for. I'm certainly looking forward to it, and I suspect many of us on the call, if not all of us, have got at least one of your publications, Dewi. I certainly have several, and I discovered another one tonight, which I wasn't even aware I had. Or I was aware I had the book, but I wasn't aware it was yours. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, I hope, and I will.
Right, so I'll take over mine.
Yep, you should be able to share now, Danny. Yep. Before Dewi starts, if we want to ask questions, everybody, please would you put them in the chat, and Sean, our webmaster, will gather the questions, and if Dewi is foolish enough to pause for breath, then he'll leap in with the questions at the appropriate time. Though in fact, Dewi says he has got points where he will say, if there are any questions, can I have them now? So if you put them in chat, I'm sure we'll pick them up as the session goes on. So over to you, Dewi.
Great, thanks very much, Alan. Evening, everyone. Let's see how we can do here. So tonight I'm going to talk about my involvement with publishing and give what I hope will be some tips on what's involved and what individual photographers might do to get their projects considered for publication. Firstly, a bit of history, and I started the company in 1994. But before then, I was involved in setting up art centres. I set one up in North Manchester in Bury, the Metro, and then I moved to set up one in Manchester, which was Corner House, now known as Home. And in 1986, it must have been, I had a conversation with the photographer John Davis. And John was just about to go off to the printers to have a book published or a book printed. I saw him a couple of days later, and he was rather dejected. He'd been disappointed at the print quality and what the publisher had actually set up for him. And as an indirect result of that, I decided to have a look at what was involved in publishing. And after a period of research and trying to understand it a bit, in 1987, I published what was effectively my first book, and that was John Davis's Green and Pleasant Land. And I carried on publishing at Corner House until I left in 94. Really, what I found was that I was getting more and more involved in the publishing side of things, and that was my key interest. And I do tend to have a problem, and that's that once I try to do something and work out how to do it, I don't necessarily work out the administrative structure behind it. And so at Corner House, my job was as director of Corner House. And by setting up the publishing side, I was simply adding work for my weekends, my evenings, etc. Anyway, in 1994, I left and went independent. And since then, we've published over 500 books. At any point, we've got round about 200 books in print, and these are distributed worldwide. We have a warehouse in the States and a warehouse in the UK, but we sell into China, States, Canada, Mexico, right across the world, really. And normally we publish between 20 and 24 books a year. But for obvious reasons with COVID, we have reduced the output quite a lot since last summer. And at the moment, we're probably doing 10 to 12 books a year. So for some reason,
There we go.
Right, so this is a selection of titles. Often people think that because we're based in the northwest of England, that we're focused on northwest photographers or British photographers. And I think you'll see from the sort of titles here, and this one, for example, is a Norwegian photographer. We're working with photographers internationally. And that's really because photography as a publisher only works at the international level. There isn't sufficient market just in the UK. And so you need to be selling into many, many other countries. You will also see that there's no similarity from one book to another. And essentially this is, we try and respond to a particular title in a very individual way. And we're trying to find the best way to put across the content of the book. And so the format changes, it's different from one book to another. And the design sense changes as well. So there's some which are very straightforward and very traditional in that sense. And then there are other books which are more complex. Now, I'm often asked about how we start with the idea of making a book. And I think before I even talk about it properly, I have to say that I'm someone who is a believer in content more than anything else. And by that, I mean that I could show you many wonderful design objects, some beautiful photography books, where I think the content is lacking. So for me, the content always leads. If it's not a strong project, then it shouldn't really be considered in book form. Now, always when you're thinking about books, you should be thinking, and if you're thinking about yourself wanting to publish a book, you should be thinking why and what. And the why is, why do you need to add another book to all the millions that are out there? What is it that is special about your project that it needs to be converted into a book? There's so many photographers who come to me and they'll say that everyone I show it to says it has to be a book. And my answer will always be why? You know, why is there an audience? So who is that audience? How can you describe an audience? I think probably the best one I ever got was from a photographer who submitted a project, and it was about girls around the age of 13, 14, as they're turning into women. And he determined, it was a male photographer, and he actually decided the audience was pretty enormous. And he described it to me as any girl, any woman, because obviously if they're a woman, they've gone through that process. Then it was any father. Then it was any grandfather. Then it was any relative. And if you start to add that up, it clearly becomes a nonsense. So when I say who is the audience, you've got to be really honest. You've actually got to think very seriously about who might be interested in your book, in your project. And that's what we try and do all the time. We're not led by the market, but I do want to feel that there is an audience for any book that we're producing. And then we come on to the whole thing of content and form. As I said, I'm someone who believes that content is the most important. But the form of a book can enhance that content. And so it is important that there's real consideration in terms of the design, in terms of the size, the materials used, everything to do with the design and finish and the production of the book. But ultimately, for me, content is always the most significant. Now, one of the questions I'm always asked is, what makes a book? And if you remember, I was talking when we were looking at some of our book covers, I mentioned the idea of having to sell internationally. And so that is one of the key things. Any book that we do has to be able to be sold in the States, in France, in Italy, across the world. It has to resonate with people. And it will resonate because it has a human element to it. That it might be a very personal project, but it resonates with other people. And that's absolutely critical with any book project we do. Now, as an example of that, we did a book with Paddy Summerfield, Mother and Father. And that book was taken more or less totally in his back garden, his parents' back garden. There's a small interlude in the middle where they're on holiday on the North Wales coast, but almost exclusively taken in the back garden. And you would think, well, that's very parochial. Why? And this is the back garden in Oxford. Why should anyone find this of any interest? And it's the subject. What it is, it's Paddy followed his parents over round about a 10-year period, and it's as they're aging. And you follow the process. You see the relationship between the mother and father, and you see the strong bond they've got between each other. But you also see them both weakening as time passes. And the book ends up with Paddy's mother becomes seriously ill, and she dies. And so his father is left in the garden tending it by himself. And then right at the end, there is the empty garden. So it's essentially the life-death cycle. It has a very human resonance to it. And because of that, we were able to sell that book anywhere in the world. People didn't need to read the text even. They understood from the sequence that we developed and from the content of those pictures. So something which is very local can be very strong, but it has to resonate with people. We're all interested in other people, but only in the way that relates back to us. And I think that's a reality that we need to bear in mind. So, content and form, again, the question, why and what? Why that form? What are you trying to do with it? How are you trying to present the work? And I'd repeat that time and time again as those are critical elements. Always ask yourself the questions, why and what? Does the world need that extra book? Now, I've been publishing for 27, 28 years now. And I have to say that even after all that time, I actually have no real idea of what I'm doing. And by that, I mean that I have no idea whether a book will sell. And I think that's something that every photographer needs to understand, that each book that is put out by a publisher is a risk, it's a gamble. We don't know what will sell. If I do a Martin Parr book, I know there's a good audience, I know there's a good market. But even Martin's books sell very differently. So there are things like The Last Resort, his classic book, or Small World, another classic. Those are books that we've published and reprinted several times. And there's clearly a market for those. But what about something by a first-time photographer or a first-time published photographer? How do we find an audience for that? So one of the things, assuming that you have a strong project as a photographer, you understand the audience, you understand what the content is about and how you want to put it into a book form. If you understand those are the elements of developing the book, getting that concept. But then who's going to take it? How do you find out about publishers? Or should you find out about publishers? We're still getting submissions from poets. This is 28 years after I started the company. We've never published a poetry book. So why do people not check? Why do they not find out about what a publisher does? If you look at publishers, you'll find they're all different. We don't do the same as Thames and Hudson. We don't do the same as Hoxton Mini Press. We don't do the same as Mac Books. Every publisher has a slightly different approach. There's also, where do they sell? There are publishers who are very focused on a particular market. Although we sell internationally, we are a British publisher. And so if you send me something which is, say, very, very Italian and only of interest to an Italian audience, it's not going to work for me. A good example would be a project we got from an Italian photographer a few years ago, was on Italian prisons and the structure there. Now, if it had been about British prisons but had resonance for other audiences, it might have been interesting. But when it was simply about the Italian prison system, I really couldn't see it working internationally. And then you need to look at the type of books that people produce. We do very different books from, again, Hoxton Mini Press. We do very different books to Café Royal. And if you know Café Royal, you'll know that their books, they do wonderful documentary work, but their books are essentially zines.
Yeah, not that clever.
Sorry, was that a question or?
No, I think somebody.
Ah, right. Okay. So Café Royal do zines. They don't do large books. And then you have to think about, how do people want to be approached? I mean, it's very easy for a photographer these days to email, to send something by WeTransfer, all those sort of things. But do we really want to be inundated by that? Now, firstly, you've got to understand what the publisher might be doing. So what I'd always suggest is obviously have a look on their websites, but also go along to your local bookshop. Find a good bookseller who will talk to you about books, photo books. You might struggle to find many bookshops that have a range of photo books, but someone like the Photographer's Gallery, for example, they'll be very happy to talk to you about the sort of things that they're selling, about what publishers are doing, and they are real experts. So it is well worth the time to do the research and find out who you should be thinking of approaching. getting yourself a shortlist. And then how do we want to be approached? As I say, it's very easy these days with the internet, but we don't want to be inundated. We want to know what's coming in. We want to be given the option to say whether or not we want to see it. And many of us work to particular timescales. We ourselves, in more normal times, work on the basis of 2 open submissions a year, usually one in May and usually one then in November. And we do that to try and group all the projects that we're getting in so that we can see them in relation to each other, so we can compare one project to another. And that really works much better for us than having several each day. Now, one of the things I have to say is that even now, we get 1,500 to 2,000 projects a year. Normally in non-COVID times, I'm also seeing many projects at portfolio review sessions, etc. I would say in an average year, I'm seeing up to 2,500 projects. And of those, we can publish perhaps 1 or 2%. So it's very easy for me to say no when you send something in a way that I find difficult or awkward. I prefer to see something physical. I prefer to have a CD or a DVD or a flash drive with a PDF on it, or a selection of images. It's much better, and part of the reason for that is if I'm traveling, for example, which I often am, again in normal times, I'm often at the printers, and it's a real pain sometimes if internet is slow to be trying to download heavy files on my laptop. So I do prefer everything to come to the office and for it to be in a physical form. One of the things I know is that if I have a pile of DVDs or flash drives that have come in, I will put that physical object in my computer. I will look at it. If it comes as an email, there's a very real risk that I'll simply delete it because I've got too much mail there, it's taking up too much time downloading, etc. Now, the other thing to say is lots of photographers will send in something and then we'll phone the next day to ask whether it's been received. Please don't do that. It's always best to give a week or two. Do follow up after that to make sure it has been received, but don't chase. I have people who chase me when I haven't even received their project. So try and think about how the publisher might respond. Don't make it easy for them to say no, because as I say, it's much easier to say no than it is to say yes. Now, one of the things that, again, people ask about a lot is how they should send work in. I think these days, as I mentioned, a PDF is fine. There's no real need to send in a book dummy. But I think what is important is that however you send the work, it's put together in a sequence in the way that you think best tells the story. I'm not really interested in seeing 500 photos. What I want to do is to see your idea of how it works as a book. And so I want you to edit down. I want you to make that first selection and to put it in a sequence that seems to you to make sense. And the reason for that is I firmly believe that the book is your book, not my book. I believe that you have to take that role of putting it together at least to the preliminary stage. I would then get involved. I'd challenge you about why that photograph is why it's in that position in the sequence, many, many things. But the first stage is always that you need to put together the edit. I know that many photographers feel they can't edit their work, but you have to try. You have to try and tell your story, because that's what it is. It's your story, not mine. Now, I'm quite happy to accept just a set of inkjet prints. They don't need to be bound together at all. Nothing like that. They really need just to present your work in the way you think is most effective. So don't worry about a book dummy, but worry about a sequence. And I'll talk more about that in a second. It's probably quite a good time to open up for any questions if there are any. Give you a bit of a breather from my voice as well.
Hi, yeah. Perhaps just a clarification there. So what I heard you there saying was physical media, something that's very easy for you to carry. So getting something on a memory stick or a DVD, you could put it on your PC and travel with it. But then
it's not so much that. It's actually that the physical object ends up on my desk.
Right.
And I have this strange guilt complex, I suppose. Whereas if there's a physical object there, I have to look at it.
Gotcha. So that then brings closure to the next part, was you just suggested a set of inkjet prints would be a great starting place. So that's something physical, tangible. You could begin to get a...
Yeah, we always used to ask for a dozen or so just inkjet prints, not exhibition prints or anything. And that gave me, as long as the photographer then also gave some sort of information about their project, it gave me enough of a starting point to see whether I needed to ask for more material. But now, most people are very used to working with PDFs. And if they put together a full PDF of all their project, then it saves going through receiving stuff and then asking for more stuff. So it speeds up the process. I'm still happy to see inkjet proofs or inkjet prints.
And so with say 1,500 to 2,000 potential projects across your desk in a year, and you're saying 1 to 2% of that actually makes the grade.
Yeah. Well, it's probably less than that, because what you have to bear in mind is there are photographers who we've worked with over a number of years. People like Dewi Wallace, for example, or Martin Parr or Simon Norfolk. And so if they have a project coming up, then that immediately takes one of the places from our available list.
Right.
So it's probably even less than 1%.
Yeah, that makes sense. You've got if you like, a portfolio of people producing work that is potentially going to make a Dewi Lewis book.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the great things of working in publishing so long is that I've got to know so many photographers over the years and published a lot of people several times. Now, it's almost, I don't keep in contact with all of them. They don't keep in contact with me, but an awful lot of them do still keep in contact. We have regular conversations, regular emails and the rest. And it does become, it's a great thing to have all those friends, but at the same time, it gets very complicated having all those friends. And it is difficult when, there can be years when 10 of those photographers all have projects that they want to publish, new projects.
Yeah.
And I don't automatically publish them because I've published them before, but I do take them very seriously.
So are there any particular tricks that you have to try and help make the cut? You know, let's say from the more random proposals that you get, how do you know, where does one get the time to look at 2,000 things?
It's quite quick. I mean, when you see that, if you think of the number of projects I must have seen over the years, what I'm looking for is something I have to be honest and say that I almost have no idea what I'm looking for until I see it. And that's because I'm looking for something which is fresh and grabs my attention, and which I feel has some sort of, you know, it will make people respond. And basically, if I'm responding and I feel a sort of a tug with it, then I hope other people will as well. But I think the key things are the freshness. It's worth saying that, and sometimes I'll have photographers who tell me they have this great idea for a project, but then they won't tell me what the idea is because they have this sort of paranoia about somehow someone else is going to copy their project. Now, I can almost guarantee that anyone out there who's done a project on anything, there will be someone else who's done the same project or covered the same subject, but they will have done it differently. So you could have, you know, 50 projects about street kids, and they will all be different. They'll all be different locations, internationally, but some will really feel very strong and feel somehow different, somehow fresh. And a lot of them will feel repetitive. And so there aren't that many subjects out there. So it is about the individual voice, which is the important thing. And so it's very important that any photographer is not trying to copy someone else's style. They've got to develop their own individual style. It'll be influenced by all sorts of people. I mean, if you're doing street photography, you might be influenced by Dewi Wallace or yeah. I mean, there's so many people you could be influenced by, but it should still feel as though it's different. You know, Bruce Gilden, for example. Bruce's style is very, very clear. I mean, I can identify a Bruce Gilden image from half a mile. And if you tried to copy it, there'd be no point. But Bruce, over the years, has been influenced by other people, and his style has developed because of those influences and his response to it. So it is about trying to get that individual voice. The tricks in getting me engaged and getting other publishers engaged. One is portfolio reviews. Obviously, it's not a good time at the moment, but portfolio, well, online ones, but they're not quite the same. Portfolio reviews. Now, you're not going to get to see me or any other publisher by calling us up and asking if you can come and have a meeting. That's not going to happen. We're looking at too many projects. We just don't have the time to do it. But you will find key editors, key publishers, curators, etc., at portfolio reviews. And you'll get the chance there to spend 20 to 30 minutes with them in a way that you would never get the opportunity elsewhere. So portfolio reviews are very important. We do things like format, for example. I did the online ones this year, but I normally would do the physical ones. We review in Arles. I've done reviews at in Paris, in Houston at PhotoFest. I've done them in Manchester. I've done them in London. I tend not to do that many a year, probably 5 or 6 at most. And generally that's the same with most publishers. So reviews give you a direct access, and it allows you to create a relationship with the publisher in a way that you can't even with online interviews. So they're well worth looking at. The other thing is, I would tell photographers not to send in projects by email, but I would also tell them to send in information. So if you have an exhibition somewhere, send in information about it with an image. If you get a review from somewhere, send that through. And it's basically, it's almost like a drip feed. If I see certain images, I start to think, well, who's that by? Oh, that's interesting. I've seen that before. And then I start to search them out. The other thing is to think very seriously about your website and how you present it. Publishers don't generally do trawls of websites. But if I read about someone or see an interview, then I may check out the website. And it needs to be easy to navigate, and it needs to show work in a clear and coherent way. So that's important. The other tip, it's actually on this sheet of submitting work, cold calling. One of the best tips is not to cold call. As I say, it's very easy for us to say no, very difficult to say yes. And if for any reason we start to feel uncomfortable about a photographer, we then start to think, well, this person might be difficult to work with. This person might be unreliable. All sorts of things start to come to the surface. And that really races the no to the front. So a very long reply there, I'm afraid. Any more questions?
Fully understood that one. I could perhaps say it's a similar idea to if you're trying to look for something new and interesting on Instagram, you find yourself flicking through several hundred pictures before you find one that you go, oh, that's nice.
Yeah. Exactly. It is also worth saying that there are projects that for example, we don't do anything which is simply travelogues. So we're not interested in someone's trip through Europe. We're not interested in a project I had not long ago was some good photographs, but from Madrid, Porto, Venice, Rome, and there was no real link between them. Individually, they were all right, but they just didn't work. And at that point, it's actually worth saying that for me, a book is not a collection. And it's important to get that across. By that, I mean, yes, I might do a book of Cartier-Bresson, collected works and retrospective looking at some of his strongest works. But with most photographers, projects are projects. They need to be about a specific subject. They need to hold together and they need to link from one thing to another. Right, in fact, I'll just say something about that in terms of sequence. Because one of the things that, again, that photographers are concerned about with editing their work, they're concerned about how to sequence it. And let me just tell you how I sometimes do it. I don't necessarily start with the first image. What I will sometimes do, quite often, is to start with the last image. And the reason for that is I want to get a sense of what I want to leave the viewer with. What sort of mood do I want them to be in? Do I want to be taking them out on a high, or do I want to be depressing it in some way? Do I want to leave them with a question mark? So sometimes the last image can be the important one. But one of the things I'm doing when I'm sequencing, I'm looking for two things primarily. A logical sequence, and by that I mean a sequence that follows a certain narrative. So it makes sense that image number 2 follows 1 and 3 follows 2. So there's a logic to it, there's a narrative logic. But then I'm also looking at a visual logic. So if I've got two images on 2 pages facing each other, I want to try and find a relationship between those 2 images. And my ideal, whenever I'm sequencing, is to have a logical link and a visual link. I can't always achieve it, but that's the ideal. And what I'll often do is I'll work with small groups of photographs to put together perhaps 6, 7, 8 images that seem to me to link together very well. Then I'll do another 5 or 6 that seem to link together very well. And then I put those mini sequences together. So it is very much a jigsaw approach. And it's part logical, part visual. And then the final thing on that is just, there's a question there, designed. Now, when I say sequenced or designed, what I mean is I want to see something sequenced, but I don't necessarily want to see something designed. And there's a very simple reason for that, is if you design something, you're adding another level, and you're adding a level that I might really dislike. If the design is overpowering and feels to me to overpower the images, then there's a real danger that I might be put off by the design, even though if I'm just seeing the sequence, I might have been interested. So that's, I mean, it's a difficult one to describe, but sometimes I do get projects which feel as though where they are in finished dummies, and they feel as though they've been designed for the Sunday Times magazine. And it makes it hard to get a sense of what the images are really about and the story that's being told. It feels too heavy with design. Right, so shall we move on, or any more questions?
No, we're good. Let's crack on.
Now, portfolio, I was talking about portfolios before, portfolio sessions, and this is one which was, I think that was in Dublin. So it's very personal, you know, you're face to face with people you'd never get a chance to meet. The other thing is to go to the book fairs. This, the image before and this one, they're both at Paris Photo in the Le Grand Palais. And it is worth, it's worth mentioning that those big photo fairs, whether it's Photo London, whether it's Paris Photo or something like Aperture Festival, those events are very good because, again, you actually do get the opportunity to be face to face with the publishers, to see the work that they're producing, because essentially the publishers are there behind tables trying to sell their books. And I think, and they're there 8-9 hours a day. They have quiet moments. They're generally quite happy to talk during the quiet moments. They may even be willing to look at your work. But I think what it does is it gives you a real sense of what a publisher is putting out, and it gives you a sense of being able to decide who might be the most relevant publisher for you to approach. Now, the self-publishing has taken off quite a lot over recent years. It's become very, very important. There's so many books now being self-published. But what does it involve? So I think that the starting point is to know what a publisher actually does. Essentially, we're putting books out into public spaces. But what's that involve? The starting point is seeing the work. So it's actually the process we've been talking about of looking at photographers' work, selecting down, then working with the photographer to put it into a form that would, we feel, work as a book. So that's essentially the editorial process. But we then have to do something with the book. So we have to get it out to the market. We have to sell it. And the sales of books are generally, this is in terms of a more traditional publisher such as ourselves. We are selling to bookshops, we're selling online, we're selling through Amazon, we're selling direct from our website. But the traditional model is that you sell through a distributor. You have a distributor, and the distributor sells on to wholesalers and bookshops. And before COVID, I would say our sales via bookshops and wholesalers were running at about 75 to 80% of our turnover. And our own direct sales were at about 20%. Of course, COVID has had a massive impact, and our sales to shops dropped by more than 50%. So they're starting slowly to come back up. But our sales dropped by around about 50%. Thankfully, our direct sales went up by about 50% as well. So the internet sales didn't, or the website sales didn't close the gap entirely. And we're probably down 35 to 40% on what we were selling before COVID. So there's the marketing thing, the selling operation. But then there's the marketing, and marketing obviously involves press releases, dealing with the press, knowing what magazines are out there, knowing who to deal with there, having contacts who will be interested in looking at what you're producing. So you have the editorial, you have the selling through the trade, the distribution side, then you have the marketing, and under all of that, you of course have the financial management, and you also have all the administration. So there's quite a range of skills that are actually required, and it is problematic. You are switching one moment from editorial to the next, dealing with invoicing. In a large company, obviously, you're not having to face that. But in smaller companies, and many publishers are small companies, that's what the day-to-day is. A lot of different skills. One of the other things that I mentioned editorial, I mentioned selling. I didn't mention the production side, where we design 90 to 95% of our books. I do the majority myself. And we also go on press for most books, again, in normal circumstances. I haven't been on press now since last February. So alongside the editorial, we're also dealing with every aspect of the production and the design. So that's the skill mix that's needed to be involved in publishing. As I say, with a larger publisher, you can spread it across a number of different people. But if you're a self-publisher, you need to be able to handle all those elements. And that's a lot for one person to be able to do. Of course, you can hire people in, but that's expensive. So if you're looking at self-publishing, you've got to realize the range of work that's being involved. And of course, you've got to finance it. Now, that's different these days. Increasingly, publishers need to raise funds to publish photography books. That's very different from when I started 25 years ago. Now, I think we're funding about 60% of the cost of the books that we do. But the other 35, 40% is coming from things like Kickstarter, funds raised by the photographer, sponsorship, etc. So it's a very different model. But when I say 60, 65% is what we're putting in, some books we're putting in 100%. Some books are 100% funded. So it's between those two, but we are still putting in quite a lot of money. As a self-publisher, you'll have to raise it all yourself. And that is a challenge. Kickstarter, as I say, is possible, and I'll talk about that shortly, but it is hard work. So you might be faced with a choice where, say your book is going to cost £10,000. You could either self-publish and then you get a financial return if it goes well, or you could hand that money over to a publisher to do it on your behalf. But of course, you'll get very little of that finance back then. But as a self-publisher, I would say that if you're doing a book and it's costing £10,000, you're going to need to spend the next year after the book is published working on selling it. It's going to take that sort of time period when you're heavily involved in every aspect of the book. So it is a question to ask yourselves. Now, one of the next points really is to, I mentioned their funding. And so we should look at that. We should talk about the funding scenarios. As I say, Kickstarter is a possible, but it is, even Kickstarter is quite hard work, and it is quite difficult to reach targets. I'll go back to this now, funding the book. As I said, you as a self-publisher could publish with £10,000, or you could hand it over to a publisher. And one of the things that's not really understood would be that even if all the production costs are met, there's still a cost to a publisher. So if a book's going to cost £10,000 to produce, and you have £10,000 to give me, even if I like the book, even if it's strong, I may decide against it because just producing that book is going to cost me another £2,000 to £3,000. And that's things such as going on press, time involved in all of that, the costs of sending things backwards and forwards to the printers and backwards and forwards to the photographer, the cost of sending out press copies. Generally, if we're sending out press copies around the world to various magazines, etc., I expect to spend close to £1,000 on that. So there are other costs that still need to be met, even if the cost of printing the book is met by a photographer. Now, that will usually be our risk, and we will hope to get that back by sales of the book. Now, how do you get that £10,000? How do you fund that gap? Crowdsourcing, Kickstarter, I've mentioned. Kickstarter is difficult. You need to talk to someone who's been involved in it before. You need to do lots of research. You need to look at successful projects and see the sort of rewards they've offered, and also the targets they've gone for. It's very easy for someone to say, oh, well, I'll go for 15,000. They manage to raise 12,000. They don't reach their target. They lose all the money that had been promised. So it does need serious thinking through. But of course, there are other measures for advanced sales. The most obvious one is to have, if you have a gallery, for example, then you might be able to persuade your galleries to take a couple of hundred copies of the book. Or you might be able to persuade a sponsor that they will receive perhaps 300-400 copies for giving out to customers. So those sort of things are possible. And then finally, personal investment. Now, personal investment, I would always veer away from that. I think it's very dangerous. One of the things that sometimes photographers think is that 1,000 copies of the book, the retail price is £35, I will get back £35,000. Firstly, you've got to sell all the books, but more importantly, if you're selling those books through the trade, then you won't get back 35,000. You'll get back nearer 11,000, 12,000, because the bookshops take a high discount. The internet sellers take a very high discount, as do the wholesalers. We ourselves expect to get back no more than 35 to 37% of the retail price of a book. So be warned about that. Now, I'm conscious of time, so I think we'll, if we can move to any questions, that would be great.
Dewi, just one thing to clarify for me, it's a language one. Going on press, does that mean going to the printers to physically see the thing being made?
Yes, that actually means being at the printers, overseeing the book going through the process. I mean, you need to be using good printers. I mean, we're working with company EBS in Verona, and I'm quite happy with them printing by themselves, which is what they need to do at the moment. But I would say you always get a few extra percentage points of quality if you're there on press. And that's because when you're printing, a lot of pages will be printed on the same sheet. And there'll be, you or the photographer will know which are the most important images. So if there are any compromises need to be made, you know where to make the compromises. The press guys themselves will make their own compromises. And it's always better if you or the photographer can make those.
Are there any sort of technical things, you know, I've learned over the years, printing on different paper and different methods of printing can, enhance or degrade an image. So is that something that you get involved with when you're at the printer as well?
You need to know that at the design stage. So that's part of the production process for us. Selecting various papers, knowing how papers perform, really, how well they take the ink, etc. It's unfortunately, I mean, that's probably just by itself an hour's talk. So it's why I've skirted around that.
And another chance, yeah.
And materials as well for the sort of binding materials that you can have, the range of binding options that there are. There's a lot of technical information in all of that. I mean, I'll just very quickly, before I just realized I hadn't covered this. One of the things I do say to photographers is to think outside the book. Books are expensive to produce, and not everyone will get to that success point of having their book published. So why not look at alternative ways of doing it? During lockdown, we published it in February, I think now. We did a book with Dewi Lewis, which is, he's been photographing throughout London or central London during lockdown. And it's still work in progress, but he's done an awful lot of work. So we decided to put together something as a limited edition, 100 copies. And we wanted to make it, the work's very dramatic, so we wanted to do something quite large. And we decided to go for an A3 format and to wire bind it. We printed digitally, which we never do. All our printing is offset printing. But for this, we printed digitally. And to make the whole project work, we then sourced boxes which are nicely bound in a black material. And we sourced various labels, various materials, really to enhance the whole project. And so what it meant we were able to do, rather than going and produce something where we need to print 1,000 copies at £10,000 plus, we were able to put together 100 copies. It's a 48-page book. It's actually extremely beautiful. It feels like a special portfolio. It's in a wonderful box. It's enhanced in a number of ways, signed individually by Dewi, so we could make something special. So at one session, I was talking with a photographer, Tristan Poyser, who I know very well from Manchester. And one of the things I said to him was, he showed me a project, and I felt although it was very good, it wouldn't have the audience for a book, and there was no money for a book either. I'll just show you something quickly of his. So, following a session I had with Tristan decided that he would make his own box set. And this is again sourcing, this is A5 size. He sourced the boxes. He's then put on these labels. And firstly, I should tell you the project is early on in lockdown. Tristan has a young family, and with all his photography work sliding out of the door, he decided he needed to go and earn some extra income, and he went to work at Amazon, in a local Amazon warehouse. And following on from that, he was able to persuade them to let him photograph there and to photograph staff. And the project grew, and this is a selection of the result. So this is kind of looking like it's a QR code label. It looks as though it's something that might be on an Amazon box.
It does look very much like something you'd get shoved through your letterbox from Amazon, yes.
Yeah.
And then he's wrapped it, he's got a special paper here to bind around it to wrap it. And then this is what it's like inside. So again, he's used some special paper to make it feel more of an item. I forget now how many images are in the box. I think 30, 35. The whole thing is signed, and he's selling it at £35. Now, it's not published by us, it's published directly by Tristan, but as something we wanted to do to support him was that we put it on our website, and we have helped sell copies for him. And we did a mail shot, and I think we sold more than half of the edition for him. But I think it's a nice object. It's an edition of 50 copies. It will feel for Tristan as though it's a completion of the project, and it's something he can be proud of. So this is much better, I think, than trying to do a blurb book or something like that. It's something much more special. You can get it out there. You can use it as a marketing tool if you want. If you can't sell them, you can give them to people who might be able to help or influence your future in some way. So it's well worth looking at things like that. So, right, return to questions if there are any.
Well, yeah, great. That was very interesting, that concept. Yeah, really good. So a good question here from Casey. So Casey's a university student. It's really just, really, so thank you, actually, just saying this has helped massively in terms of thinking about the practicalities of book publishing. So that's really good. And then I've got a question here from Amber. I know Dewi mentioned physical prints and PDFs. It often feels like everyone out there is learning InDesign in order to sequence and create books. Is this a necessary thing to learn? You know, do you need to learn some tools about sort of design layouts?
No, definitely not. I mean, I actually still, well, I work with InDesign, but I also use Quark, which was the earliest page layout tool software. And that's still very good. I actually prefer Quark. I'd probably do 40% on InDesign. InDesign is, yeah, it's useful, but why not just put together individual JPEGs and just sequence them in a PDF? Much quicker. There is no need to learn InDesign. I'm often sent InDesign files, which then take me longer to rework than they would starting from scratch. So unless you want InDesign for, say for example, you're designing a gallery poster or an invitation or something like that, but it's complicated design books. You need to know technical specifications. You need to know about bleed, and you need to know about what gutter margins to allow for. There are lots of things you need to know. So I wouldn't recommend it.
Okay, good. Question here from Deborah, who might have missed the first minute or two. Is how did you get started as a publisher? So I think that one's answered. Maybe it's easier for Deborah to get the video when we eventually post it on the RPS site.
Okay.
Unless you wanted to.
Okay, no, very quickly. I was running art centres, and in a conversation with John Davis, a good friend of mine, he was very disappointed with a couple of books he'd produced or he had produced by a publisher. So I started from there. I thought, well, okay, how can we get these books produced properly? And the very first book I did was John Davis, Green Pleasant Land, published while I was at Corner House. And the rest is history, as they say.
Yes. So you mentioned earlier about great places to get photo books, and you mentioned the Photographer's Gallery, and I do think that's a great place to get books. Are there any other sort of, if you like, honeypots around the rest of the country?
Unfortunately not. There are a number of good online sellers, Photo Bookstore, for example, or Beyond Words. There are a number of good online bookshops run by people who know about photography. But there are very few physical spaces. And perhaps 10 years ago, we used to sell a lot through, perhaps even 15 years ago, we used to sell a lot through people like Waterstones, but they've kind of removed themselves from much in the way of visual books now.
I see. Well, thanks for that. I'll hand you back over to Alan.
Right.
Right.
I think, would you like to stop sharing then, and we'll wrap up then?
Yeah, fine.
Dewi?
Okay.
Well, I'm going to share my screen again, and just. Is everybody seeing a little screen?
Yes, we're seeing you now.
Yeah, all there.
Okay. So I'm just finish off by saying thank you very much, Dewi. It's been an interesting hour and a quarter. It's been fascinating. We've everybody's been grabbed, their attention grabbed, and that's great. And just for those of you who are interested, we are going to put it on YouTube. It'll be as quickly as I can get it edited and over to the folk in Bristol. Now that I've worked out the best way to do it, it's going to be quicker. So thank you to Dewi for coming along. Thank you to Sean for co-hosting and capturing the questions we've had. And just a little bit of advertising. Next month we've got Donna Bridgewater and her Getting Through This project, which many of you will have seen probably on Instagram, Facebook, and in the BBC website actually. So and in the other press around the Midlands. So it's going to be an interesting session with Donna. She's very enthusiastic and has produced a piece of work which I think resonates extremely well with the times. So go online and do that. And also I'll give you a quick bit of advertising for our June session, which is going to be with Stacey Kranitz from the States. Again, another person who embeds herself in communities in the Appalachian Mountains and produces some quite stunning work. So thank you very much again, Dewi, and thank you everybody.
A pleasure. Thanks very much to everyone, and enjoy the rest of the evening.
Thank you very much. Keep safe, everyone.
Thanks, Sean.
When I'm in full screen, it's always hard to stop it. There we go. So thank you, everybody, and good night.
Night.